Hey guys, it's Aaron, or LM9, and today I'm super excited to show you guys the first installment of my custom LEGO figures from Star Wars: The Bad Batch. At the time of recording this, the last episode of the show to air was episode 13, so there may be some slight spoilers up to that point, but I'll try to keep them as minimal as possible. Now, in this first wave of figures, I have 6 of them, which are the original Bad Batch from the start of the series, plus Omega. And before I move on, yes, I'm making a whole bunch of other figures from the show, which I'll touch more on later. So now, let's go ahead and take a look at these guys. Now, while taking one general look at the original 5 members of the Bad Batch here, I did want to say that this project was collaborative between NatesMinifigs, who designed the helmets for each of them, my friend Andy, aka delta.png on Instagram, who did some sculpt work on the torsos and the hairs, and obviously myself. The first figure we're going to be taking a look at is Hunter, the leader of the batch. Starting off with his weapons, I gave him a Brick Arms DC-17 blaster pistol and made a custom knife for him. Now, the sculpted details on this guy include the upper torso armor, the knee pads, and the wrists. Some other 3D elements on this guy include the shoulders and the backpack, which are some resin printed pieces by NatesMinifigs. Now, the color scheme of this figure, and, well, the majority of the Bad Batch, are 2 tones of gray, one lighter and one darker, and then some red accents here and there. I used some black for all of the detail work and the line work on these guys, such as like the boot detail, some linings around the shins, some knee pad detail, line work on the abs, and outlining sections on the arms. One thing you might notice that is on all of these figures is that the ab sections I used a little bit of a lighter gray just as some highlights, which I think turned out pretty nice on these guys and was a nice little style that I was experimenting with. Now, Hunter has these gigantic shoulder pads, so I used some commando shoulders from Nate to achieve this look, and on here I also painted the 99 logos in the Bad Batch skull. And I think some of these lines could be a little better, so I might go back in the future to touch them up, but I think they do their job for now. Now, here's a better look at the backpack. It's attached via a magnet, so I can take it off if I wanted to, which helps with the clearance for the hairpiece. Before we get into that, though, here's a better look at the helmet. I'm really fond of how this helmet turns out. I think Nate did a perfect job modeling it, and I'm just really pleased with the paintwork on this. Now, with all of these guys, I did make some unmasked heads, so here's what Hunter's looks like. The hair was beautifully sculpted by Andy, and then I painted it along with the skull tattoo, the eyebrows, and the stubble on the face. I'm definitely really pleased with how this looks. One last thing, when making each of these guys, I would add some silver battle damage to like the edges of the armor, wash the figure in a black very lightly, and then go back with a Tamiya weathering kit to add some additional silver or black scuffs and blushing. And then sealed the figures with a Krylon matte finish, just to give them, the same consistent finish across the board. And then I used a brush-applicable gloss varnish or satin varnish on certain areas like the visors and lights that needed it. Anyway, that is going to be it for Hunter. Next up is Crosshair. Now, I wanted to do Crosshair in his original armor pre-Empire just to have the original full Bad Batch, but yes, I will be making an Imperial version later down the line. Now, this figure is pretty similar to the Hunter figure in some ways, since they almost have the same armor set in the show, they just have a little bit of variation here and there. Now, the legs are practically the exact same with the sculpted knees. The cod piece is a little different, though, just a little bit different shaping on that. Also, the darker gray on this figure is slightly darker than the dark grays on the other members of the Bad Batch. It's almost like a black, but I didn't want it to be exactly a black. So it's kind of hard to tell the difference, but it is still a little different. The torso has a much sharper chest sculpt by Andy, since it's not as rounded as Hunter's is, or like your normal clone commandos. The ab detail is also a little different from Hunter's, but you can see that I did carry over that highlighting style pretty well here, and I think it looks pretty nice. He also has a vinyl belt and a strap, and a little pouch on here, a little metal buckle, the larger stock rest, I guess is what it is, up towards his shoulder, and then some little ammo canisters. The wrists on the arms are the same exact design as Hunter's, but without that knife sheath. The shoulders were sculpted by me, and I used a little piece of styrene for that rifle stabilizer on his shoulder, at least that's what I think it is. And here you can see the 99 logos in the skull, which are pretty much in the exact same spots as Hunter's are. Moving on to the back, the backpack is a resin printed piece from AVFigures, as is his rifle. And I painted this rifle in gunmetal and weathered it a decent amount. I also modified the stock quite a bit so it actually fit in a figure's hands better and not look as massive. Now, the rifle also fits into the backpack quite well, so you can have that little function, but it does not disassemble, so you kind of have this big rifle just sticking out. But, you know, it is what it is. I'm not going to display it like this anyway. Now, the helmet on this guy was from NatesMinifigs, and I did modify it a little bit by sanding down the top of it, so it wasn't as spherical, so it was a little more flat, which I think looks pretty good. It also has an AVFigures rangefinder attachment, which can fold down. One thing I really liked about the paint job on the helmet is that the wash that I used really brought out the panel lining in the forehead especially, and I also really like how that crosshair on the visor looks. Now, taking this helmet off reveals his face, which is a modified clone head, and I repainted the cheekbones to be a little narrower. I changed the eyebrows to be angrier, and then made the mouth look a little more grouchy, and then finally added his little crosshair tattoo on his eye. The hair was sculpted by Andy, and then I painted it up. Now, like Hunter, this figure has the same weathering, washing, and sealing techniques used, and overall, I'm really happy with how this guy turned out. The next figure is the big boy, Wrecker. Now, Wrecker was definitely a fun challenge compared to the rest, which were pretty much just light sculpts and a lot of paintwork. Wrecker allowed me to sculpt a lot more, which was a ton of fun since I really enjoy sculpting a little bit more than painting, if I'm being honest. Now, for reference, here's a look at the raw sculpt before I painted it up, just so you guys can get an idea of all of the sculpt work that I put into this guy. Now, since Wrecker is a big guy, I did have to extend his arms and his legs. And Andy also did the base torso sculpt on this, and he brought in the shoulders and extended it vertically at the belt, which is the same thing he did for my Sauvage press that I made last year. I then went in and added some layers to the chest to pronounce it a little more and to reshape the collar. I also sculpted the armor onto the legs and arms to bulk them up a little bit. Now, after the sculpt was done, I moved on to the paint. Now, the paintwork on this guy wasn't too tough since I covered most of the shaping and therefore the annoying line work with the sculpt. Now, the feet have the same boot, shin, and knee patterns painted on. There's also some notable painted detail on the knife sheath as well as the cod piece. And the abs have some line work on it as well for moving up a little bit. However, the hardest line work was probably on the shoulders with these skulls and the 99 logos, which are on both of his shoulders. Moving on to the back, the backpack, which is from AVFigures, has a decent amount of painted detail on there as well. Moving up to the helmet, I'd have to say this is probably my favorite out of all of these figures. I just had a lot of fun painting that skull in white with all of the teeth. Did some black edge work on there to really bring out the details and the edges on that sculpt, and also used some red for the 99 logo and the drips on there. Underneath the helmet is a painted face, which has a new mouth and a cybernetic eye. I also carved in his scar and painted it up. Putting it back on, I did want to say that I do think the weathering on this figure is probably my favorite out of the bunch. I just really like all of the scratches and the blushing on this guy. And that is it for Wrecker. The fourth figure is Tech, the last of the original 4 Bad Batch members we met in Season 7 of the Clone Wars. Tech was probably the most difficult out of all these figures since he has white armor and white paint is a pain in the ass to work with. So for this one, I experimented a little bit, and after sculpting the armor, I sprayed it with a Tamiya white primer, which really made the painting process a little smoother and a lot easier just to actually paint white on top of that, so that way I wasn't painting, a completely black sculpt or something like that with white. Now, starting with the legs, I sculpted the knee pads, then used some E-tape for his straps around the shins, which have some different pockets on either side. Moving up to the belt, the straps that dangle down and the belt over top that is made of some vinyl material. Then the pouches were then individually sculpted and glued on. He has various tools hanging off of his belt, which were also sculpted by me on either side. The torso armor was sculpted by Andy, and then I added the canisters at the top and then painted everything from there. Now, the arms have some sculpt on the shoulders, the little pouches on, I guess, like the bicep area, and then a little bit on the wrists. Both of the arms are pretty different, so it's nice not having to paint these same designs over and over again, like Hunter and Crosshairs, for example. Also, on his shoulders, you can see the little skull logo for the Bad Batch, but unfortunately, I couldn't squeeze in that 99 on there, so it was just too small of a space, couldn't fit it on there. Moving on to the back, the backpack is a resin-printed piece from AVFigures that was then painted by me. Moving up to the head and the helmet, I decided to go with a hollow visor and painted the goggles onto the face, other than having the goggles as a 3D part of the helmet. The helmet is from Nate, but I did have to extend the forehead a little bit just to bring it down to close that gap on the face a little bit so it wasn't as big. Now, the helmet was then painted up, and some of my favorite details are that translucent visor effect I was able to achieve, and then also the 8-bit skulls on the sides. Unfortunately, the visor cannot move on this mold, but I don't really mind that too much. I don't really care. Now, taking off the helmet unveils his face, which is just a clone face with the goggles painted on, and I really like using that Tamiya clear yellow paint for this. It just worked perfectly for what I needed it. The hair is just the Mr. Incredible hair, which I think passes as a realistic version of Tech's dumb-looking hair in the show. Now, coming back to the figure as a whole, this guy has silver battle damage and also just, very, very light black wash, since I just didn't want to drench this thing and make that white too dark, but I did want to bring it down just a little bit to make it look a little more worn. Now, one last thing I did make for Tech was his little data pad. He uses this thing a lot in the show, so I figured it would be a good accessory for him. I made this out of a Lego bar for the handle and then just a cut piece of flat styrene for the rest of the pad. Then just sculpted all of the little pieces on there and painted it up. Overall, I'm really proud of how this guy turned out, so let me know your guys' thoughts. The last of the boys of the squad is Echo. Now, Echo was actually the first of the Bad Batch that I finished up a couple months ago when the show premiered, so I've had him done for quite a while. Now, the legs have the knee pads sculpted on, as well as the little joints on the side, since he does have, robotic legs. And then I painted everything up from there. Now, if I'm being honest, I do think I went a little overboard with the battle damage on the legs, but that AVFigures waist cape kind of covers that up, so it's not as noticeable. But I do still think, this was my first one, so it's kind of my trial run, so this one did have a little bit more thicker damage on there. I wish I went a little thinner with it, but at this point, it's sealed, and I can't really do anything about it. But moving up, the torso is probably my favorite part of this figure. I did a really, really thin sculpt for the chest plate and then painted everything else. I'm really, really pleased with that belt area with all the paintwork on there and then all of the details on the abs. And I think the highlights around that black really help bring out that design on there. He has a reasonable amount of scuffing on the chest along with the first Bad Batch skull I ever painted, so it's a little different from the rest, but it still works. Moving on to the arms, his left arm just has a comlink sculpted on to the wrist. Everything else is just painted up. His right arm has that scomp link thing or whatever it is, the tip of which is just from the AVFigures printed arm, but I chopped it off so that way I could add a magnetic joint there at the elbow. Then I used an upper arm from an official Lego piece. I think that modification worked pretty well. His backpack is the same mold as Tech's from AVFigures. I just painted it up and magnetized it so it can come off when dealing with the helmet. Now, the helmet is from Nate, and then I painted it up using some various shades of gray. Then I used some gunmetal and some red and yellow for his headpiece. The helmet does come off just normally, and I do have this headpiece from 97 Lego Maniac in BensonBone that can magnetically attach to the head to give Echo his proper unhelmeted look. Now, it would have been cool to have that helmet come apart like it does in the show, but I didn't think it was really worth the effort of trying to figure that out. So it's just two separate pieces at this point. Now, the head is the light flesh version of the clone head, which came out a couple years ago, which I think works for Echo since he is paler than the rest of the batch, and it's not too pale where he looks super, super pasty. And I think this works as a nice middle ground. I did just add some bags underneath the eyes and the bolts on his head, just as the little painted detail. But other than that, that is it for Echo. And the last figure I have to show you guys in this video is Omega. By far the simplest of the batch, and it was a nice break for making some gray armored figures. Starting off with her energy bow, this was designed by 97 Lego Maniac and then printed by BensonBone, who then sent me a sample, and I think it's awesome. I think they do plan to sell these at some point, possibly through Nate, but I'm not quite sure of when, so you guys should go follow both of them for updates on that. So I took this bow and then painted it up using some Citadel gold paint. Then use some bronze, some black, and then the pink for the arrow, and just for the other details on this bow. So I'm going to take this out of the way so that way we can get a better look at the figure. The legs on it are just the standard Lego short legs, and I did use some vinyl for the tunic extension, and then also for the belt that wraps around over top of that and closes that gap. The torso has the upper part of the tunic, I guess by the shoulders, sculpted to give it a little more unique shape. Then everything else was just painted in white and dark blue as the main colors, and then I used some black and light gray for the details and the wrinkles and the stitching and stuff like that. The arms are pretty basic. They just have some dark blue and some red on it. Moving up to the head, her face is just the Cho Chang head from one of the newer Harry Potter book sets. It was recommended to me by Joe Iorio over on Instagram, gave me a recommendation for that, and I think it works pretty well as just a standard printed Lego head for her. Now, the hair is a completely sculpted piece that I did and then painted it up, and I think it looks pretty nice, especially for one of my first completely sculpted hair pieces. I think it works. Now, I know in the show she wears a bandolier sometimes, but I couldn't really find good reference for it, and I just didn't feel like it was a necessary addition just yet. I didn't add her little wrist communicator thing just because Cad Bane smashes it with his foot, so I didn't feel like that was necessary, but hopefully she doesn't get too many more additions to her outfit throughout the show, because I'll be mad. But anyway, that is it for Omega. Now, overall, I am really pleased with how these 6 figures turned out, and I can't wait to continue working on some more from the show. Here's a little sneak peek. I'll be doing Hauser, of course, Imperial Crosshair, Captain Gray, and Elite Squad Trooper Cad Bane, and Rex for the next part. But if there's anyone else you guys are dying to see, then just let me know. Overall, as a show, Bad Batch, I think, is kind of mediocre right now. Just to get into my thoughts for the show at the very end, I touched on it in my update video, and I talked about how I thought there's some good moments here and there, which there definitely still are, but it seems like some of the plot points just kind of like wrapped up, and we're not getting much elaboration on some of it, and there's some just random filler episodes here and there, and I don't know if this show's getting a second season at this point, so it's like, why? I don't know, man. It's just a lot to go into, and I don't want to rant for too long at the end of this. But yeah, not the hugest fan of the show overall. I think the Clone Wars is still so much better, but the show still does have some really good moments and just some really good ideas that I wish they would explore a little more. So let me know down in the comments what you guys think of all of these figures and what you guys are thinking of the show so far, because I'd love to hear it. Be sure to give everyone I mentioned in this video a follow. Links to all of them will be down in the description. But anyway, that is going to be it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys later.